Okay, I think as everyone filters in, we'll just start with an introduction. Hello, everyone. My name is Caroline. I am the program manager for the Asia Pacific Water Scarcity Program and also the NextGen program here at FAO. This webinar is the third webinar in our series to promote our next generation irrigation in water management policy brief series. Next slide, please. The two programs that the policy brief series is based on is FAO's NextGen program and also the Asia Pacific Water Scarcity Program. Our NextGen program has recently closed, and this program looked at global best practices to accelerate the modernization of irrigation systems and water management in the Asia Pacific region, seeking to promote the implementation of integrated and evidence-based policies and practices in micro and macro environments using technological, organizational, and social innovations. Our water scarcity program is our program that is currently active, and this is a program that is operating in Cambodia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam with an expansion to Laos and Mongolia. The objectives of the water scarcity program are 1, to develop practical capacity in routine water accounting, 2, to develop water allocation frameworks and processes and embed these within government, 3, to work with farmers and water managers to adapt to water scarcity, and 4, to support regional cooperative platform. The speakers you'll hear from today all work in the realm of governance, and the focus of the talk today will be looking at water tenure, JEDC in water resource management, and we'll also be learning from lessons from our sister project, the Water Scarcity Program, the Water Scarcity Initiative from the Near East and North Africa. Next slide, please. Our webinar today focuses on water for all. At the heart of every thriving society lies equitable access to essential resources, water being paramount among them. As we navigate the realms of agricultural practices in the Asia-Pacific region, it has become evident that water governance isn't just about hydrology. In fact, it's intertwined with societal structures and nuanced community dynamics. Through this webinar, in partnership with the University of Technology Sydney and FAO under the Next Generation Irrigation Program and the Asia Pacific Water Scarcity Program, we aim to explore and emphasise the principles of inclusive water governance, understanding whose interests are prioritised and ensuring that policy decisions resonate with the lived realities of all stakeholders. And with that, I will hand over to Lucy from AWP, who will introduce today's speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. Hi, everyone. It's great to be joining you today. As Caroline mentioned, I'll be introducing our speakers for this webinar. So our first speaker is Stephen Hodgson. Stephen is an environmental lawyer who has advised governments, international organisations and NGOs in over 50 countries around the world. Stephen will be presenting on water tenure with a focus on case studies in Indonesia, Cambodia, Thailand and Vietnam. Next, we will hear from Melita Grant. Melita specialises in integrated water resources management and water, sanitation and hygiene in international development with a focus on gender equality and inclusion. Melita's presentation will explore why it's essential to apply a JEDC lens to water management. And our final speaker is Dubravka Boj. Dubravka is a program officer at FAO who provides support and advice on governance issues related to the management of natural resources and food systems transformation. Dubravka's presentation will cover water governance and key messages from the experience of the Near East and North Africa region. I'll now hand over to Stephen.
Good morning, everybody. Pleased to be here. Next slide, please. Yes, in this presentation, I'm going to try and answer 4 questions. First of all, what is water tenure? Second, why are we talking about water tenure and not water rights, water entitlements, allocations? Third, why does water tenure matter? And fourth, what is a water tenure assessment? Next, please. So the working definition, hang on, you've missed the slide. Missing a slide. Okay, there's a glitch here. So there's a definite definition of water tenure is missing from the slides. So the definition we use of water tenure is the relationship, whether legally or customarily defined, between people as individuals or groups and water resources. So a few key points to note about the definition, sorry you can't see it, is we're talking about water resources specifically, not water in the abstract. Also, the definition recognizes the concept of legal pluralism. Not all of our rules come from formal law. That's a key point. Third, tenure is a social construct. And fourth, the notion of the relationship is complex. It's not just my individual relationship with the resource. It's not just my relationship with you and the resource. It's all of our relationships with water resources, all of our relationships as society. Next slide, please. So unlike land tenure, water tenure relationships are physical, dynamic, and can operate over great distances. So the slide on the left of some land plots, if I'm the owner of land plot A, I have a physical relationship with my neighbors B and E, possibly with F, but my relationship with the other landowners is purely social, purely constructed. However, for water tenure, it's a little bit more complex. On the diagram on the right, the green area is an area where customary law applies to the use of water, forests, life in general. If somebody upstream, however, builds a new reservoir, the orange triangle, and a new irrigation scheme, and a new factory, next please, those uses of water are going to impact the uses of water in the customary tenure area, but also those uses of water will take place on the basis of quite different types of water arrangement, created, for example, on the basis of formal law, on the basis of permits or concession agreements. Next slide, please. And this can be very complicated. Take this example here. The points where the lines are coming down from are from a new reservoir. So the uses of water from that new reservoir will impact the small village water supply system in the little houses. It will impact a traditional irrigation scheme. It will impact the wetland, which is a protected area and where people defend their livelihoods. Of course, there will be a physical impact, but there will also be an impact in terms of the different types of tenure relationship. For example, a large-scale hydropower plant constructed on the basis of a concession agreement protected by international investment law has much more weight, much more authority, much more power than typically arrangements based on customary or local law. And that matters because how do you actually account for, how do you actually protect these existing uses, these existing tenure relationships? It's a little bit like a game of Monopoly, a game of chess. If you have a stronger water tenure relationship, a stronger type of water right, you will trump the downstream users, the other affected users. But it's not a game, it's life. It affects people's lives, it affects people's livelihoods. It's an important issue, and traditionally we haven't paid enough focus on this relationship between the multitude of different types of water tenure relationship. As you can see, this slide is already very complex, but this is only a small part of a small river system. So you can imagine if you went all the way up and down the river, all of the uses will impact each other, but all of the tenure relationships as well. So next slide, please. So a key point to note is the water tenure is complex. Many types of water relationships derive from formal law, from a number of different sources. For example, a lot of water tenure relationships may derive from a water resources law, such as permit-based formal water rights, exempt small-scale uses, and so on. Other rights derive from irrigation legislation. Other arrangements derive from case law, particularly in common law countries, from investment law, from international investment treaties, from land tenure law, and other sources which are not included here, such as, for example, the legal personality of rivers, which is an emerging type of tenure arrangement. Next slide, please. But not all of the type of water tenure arrangements derive from formal law. Many of them don't derive from formal law. These include customary water tenure, religious water tenure based on religious beliefs, informal arrangements which may be innocent, may be tolerated, perhaps because, as is often the case, the water law is not fully implemented, or they may just be criminal. There may be a matter of water theft. Then there are other types of strange water tenure, assumed water tenure. We assume that because it's a government water supply scheme, they have the right to take the water. Impossible water tenure, water rights given to a water committee, a water community that doesn't actually have legal personality. Legally, it's impossible for an informal arrangement to actually hold formal water rights. And many types of water tenure arrangement are simply unrecognized. Water laws are concerned mostly with the abstraction and impoundment of water for irrigation and so on. But what about inland fisheries? What about people who derive their livelihoods from water being left in wetlands? How are their rights and interests protected? The answer is usually not. Next slide, please. So water tenure arrangements are clearly not the same. Some are more secure than others. So what are some of the factors that impact the relative security of water tenure? Well, on paper at least, the fact of legal recognition, if a water tenure arrangement is recognized by formal law, it should be stronger. The duration of the right that's created, a 1-year right, is clearly less secure than a 10-year right or a 25-year right. If the tenure arrangement specifies the amount of water, the quantity that you can abstract or otherwise use, that's got to make your right stronger. But also explicit legal protection. Does the law specifically say that existing rights must be protected when new allocation decisions are made? But legal security depends very much on implementation and enforcement. And sadly, in too many countries, even if a new water law has been adopted, and many countries are still using old laws, the subordinate legislation hasn't been put in place to give effect to the water law, or the legislation is not implemented, or the legislation is not enforced. So the result is that security of tenure on paper is illusory in practice. Next slide, please. So this is the whole list of Okay, sorry, I've jumped ahead. So a good example is permitting. Permitting based on integrated water resources management is costly to implement. On the left, you have the diagram showing the whole process, the whole costly process from data collection through to plan making, through to decision making and enforcement. But if your water permitting system looks like the picture on the right, i.e. a shambles, then the protection that the law pretends to provide will be illusory. Next slide, please. So in fact, the tenure arrangements are derived from formal law, and here you've got the full list of both types of tenure arrangement. The tenure arrangements, security of those tenure arrangements may in fact be illusory, and it may in practice be the case that tenure arrangements that don't derive from formal law, particularly in remote areas or in countries where the law isn't very well implemented, actually provide greater security to water users. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about water tenure and not some of the other terms we typically use, like water rights? Well, very quickly here, there are lots of different types of water rights. Many of the arrangements we're talking are expressed in terms of water rights, but many of them are not. There are also some other issues. We get confusion with the human right to water, and in many countries, because of the debate about transferable, tradable water rights, the term is in fact a bit toxic. So when we talk about water rights, there's a big risk of confusion. We may be talking about quite different things. Second, they're not really allocations. If someone's stealing water, it's not really an allocation. It's just theft. In fact, informal arrangements are not allocated. So talking about allocations gives them a kind of status they don't deserve. Same with entitlements. They're very often not entitlements. So it seems better to use a new term to make it clear that the approach is different, it's new, to focus to examine the relationship with water resources in all its complexity. To say we're starting from scratch, we're talking about water tenure. We go beyond what is written. We're trying to assess the implementation of formal legal relationships to understand the reality on the ground, to understand how the different tenure arrangements interact, and also to provide a basis for this discussion about allocation, about equity, about gender, about the reality of our relationship with water resources. So next slide, please. Very quickly, why does water tenure matter? Well, for governments, the basic challenge is how to allocate water to new uses while respecting existing legitimate uses, how to reallocate water resources in the light of changing needs. Next slide, please. So we go back to the diagram, the river color has changed. Yes, if you can go on through there. New allocations of water, new uses of water. How do you actually do this while respecting the existing uses? So keep clicking, please. The new developments coming up, showing the new uses of water, the new tenure arrangements. Please keep going. It's a bit slow. Keep going, keep going. So that's for governments at the high level. How do you allocate water? How do you prevent the double allocation of water? How do you protect existing interests and rights? How do you balance the need of water for food and hydropower and drinking and navigation and fishing and so on? Next slide, please. It's also important, though, if you want to, next slide, too many movements. So that's, yeah, keep going. Something's gone wrong here. This slideshow has gone a bit strange. So why does it matter if you're not a government? Well, first of all, if you want to eat, we all want to eat. We all need to rely on irrigation more and more because of the increasing demand for food. So for irrigated agriculture, particularly on public irrigation schemes, is all about water tenure arrangements. So if I'm the little person here in the irrigation scheme at the bottom right hand side, my right to water depends on my relationship with the water use organization, which holds our right to water in common and has a relationship, you can keep clicking on, with the irrigation agency, which in turn has a relationship with the water agency. If you can keep clicking, yeah. So these are all social constructs. So just receiving my water in irrigation scheme, water which is necessary to produce the food that we all need, depends on a complex web of water tenure relationships. And if those don't work properly, we're not going to produce enough food. Next slide, please. Same also goes for water supply, for drinking water, the water we all need. The issue of cities running out of water is not a joke. It's happening more and more. Human right to water is obviously now widely recognized. No one would deliberately prevent a city from having enough water, but it's happening all the time. We assume that public water supply is protected, but actually it's not. And in very many places, people now use their own initiative. They have their own boreholes. But again, if you can click on the slide, please. The protection, the security provided by having your own borehole is illusory if somebody can come along and drill a deeper borehole and take all of your water, which is happening all the time. And then, of course, the environmental impact, the next slide, where we still have a yellow river. Simply letting enough water in rivers is a good example. How do we protect mangroves in coastal areas? How do we make sure we don't allocate all the water to industry, to irrigation, to water supply? How do we protect our coastlines from storm surges, an increasingly big problem? So it's linked to all aspects of society, and we need to understand water tenure much more profoundly. So how do we do that? Next slide, please. So our proposal is a water tenure assessment. So very briefly, a water tenure assessment is a process to identify the water tenure arrangements in a given area, to link the arrangements to different water uses. To identify the uses first, to link the arrangements to the water uses, to assess the relative security of the water tenure arrangements, and then link the water uses to the water tenure security. I explain. Next slide, please. So first of all, we try and identify all the water tenure arrangements in a given area. So for tenure arrangements that derive from formal law, we go to the law library, we go to the literature, we do online searches. For tenure arrangements that don't derive from formal law, obviously that's much more difficult. We don't have a central document that lists those. So we do literature research, we do field work, and we have this idea of the assessment area and the field research area. Next slide. So we can't examine all of the tenure arrangements in the whole country. So we try and identify a particular assessment area. If you could go back, assessment area, which could be a river basin, and we try and understand the tenure arrangements in that given assessment area. And then we do field research in the specific field research areas. And we actually go out and talk to people, try to understand, try to build a picture of all of the tenure arrangements, formal and informal there. Next slide, please. Next, we identify the water uses. If you could go next. So these are the main headings, and we break them down into different types of water use to have a more granular picture of the different types of water uses in the assessment area. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next. Keep going, please. Next, we link the water tenure arrangements to the water uses. Why? Well, if you think about it in terms of land tenure arrangements, simply to know that all of the land is available either in ownership or on the basis of leases doesn't really tell you much about how society uses that land. So we try, and if you go back one slide, please, to link the water tenure arrangements with the water uses, so we can say this type of use is based on this type of water tenure arrangement. We've gone ahead too far. Never mind. It's a bit slow. So having linked the uses to the water tenure arrangements, we try and assess the extent to which the actual rules are implemented. We do this through a governance assessment. So this is a simple way of trying to assess how and to what extent the laws and rules are actually applied. So this is a simple governance assessment. It's not a full governance assessment that Dubravka will discuss subsequently. It's just to understand, is the law actually implemented and how does that affect tenure? So once we've done the governance assessment, if you can click onto the next slide, we link that to the security assessment to try and assess the relative security of the different types of water tenure arrangement, which we can show using a simple color scheme from dark green to light green to orange to red. Red being a situation where the water use typically in the assessment area doesn't have any security of tenure. And that's obviously crucially important for people's livelihoods, for their own security, for their own means of existence. So I'll stop there and pass on, please, to the next presenter. Thank you. To Melita.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stephen. And I know you had to go through that quickly, but you've given us a sense of some of the key terms, the water tenure, and also some of those key categorizations of how you break that down into assessing the different elements and the formal and informal laws that are related to that. So thank you for that briefing. And I'm going to now go into a little bit more detail about the who uses water and how do we consider gender equality and disability and social inclusion in that assessment process. So I'm going to talk a little bit more generally, but we can talk in the discussion more about the water tenure process and how these concepts apply to that. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to give you a bit of a background on, so we've got the same terminology. I know there are some experts in the room, and welcome to our colleagues that are from Ethiopia and the Mekong region and all around Australia and Myanmar and Cambodia. It's wonderful to see you here. And you know a lot about these topics already, so feel free to have a little snooze, but we're going to go into some of those basic concepts around gender equality and social inclusion, and then look at a framework that we use at the Australian Water Partnership and in academia and in NGOs. And then also just briefly talk about what the link might be to what Stephen just talked about and GEDSI, and then a couple of examples and some resources. So moving right along. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we're all meeting. We're all on different lands, and for me, it's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and thank them for their ongoing care for country and waters and their intimate connection to water management, to water security, to water tenure. And that leads me on to this point here about what do we mean by GEDSI, and that essentially is saying rather than just talking about farmers or irrigators or agriculturalists or industries, we're starting to unpack that within some of those big sectors and big water users, there's lots of diversity and lots of inequality as well. And that can be around poverty, disability, the social connections people have, the age of people, if they're in rural areas or urban, access to education, gender, and indigeneity. So Indigenous people have a huge stake in water tenure and water governance in general, and have largely been discriminated against and left out of the picture. So it's important to think about all these dimensions of people in the water governance context so that we don't make unintended mistakes and unintended consequences, but also so that our water governance programming actually achieves the outcomes that we're looking for. So the next slide, please. There's a few reasons why we consider GEDSI in water and agriculture related projects, and these relate to achieving the development outcomes that I just mentioned then. Also in relation to making decisions, having more holistic decisions and having all the inputs you need to make good decisions about water management. Also to genuinely deliver on the interconnected goals of the SDGs. We can't just look at one little slice of the goals. We need to be thinking about how SDG 6 connects to 5 and 2 and 11, all of the goals, because they are absolutely interconnected and dependent on each other. And then another one, which is obvious, people have different water access needs and roles. And that's everything from the way in which farming is conducted to domestic uses to governance and institutions and the way in which we're part of our water governance institutions. And finally, just thinking about people with different abilities and our need to design systems and equipment and processes that cater for a range of abilities. They're just some of the high-level reasons. The next slide, thank you. I'm sure you've all seen this continuum of JEDC approaches. So what we're trying to avoid is on the left-hand side, a JEDC harmful approach. So that's where you can animate this now, thank you. That's where we are not considering the differences between people. You're seeing people as people and just going about business as usual. That a harmful approach might also exploit the differences in society. So for instance, child labor, and make use of that. So we're trying to really avoid any harmful approach. In a responsive frame, we're starting to think about how to invite people to be part of water governance processes, water tenure assessments, accommodating their needs, understanding that people need to be included in slightly different ways, possibly if they've got care responsibilities, if they've got other types of labour responsibilities, if they've got personal mobility needs, etc. So we're starting to really think about what do people need to be involved in the process that we are conducting and responsible for. And then at the transformative end, we're starting to really think about how can our water projects not just be inclusive and include different voices, but help shift the dynamics in society. And Steve talked a lot about social constructs. So that's where we start to unpack, well, what are the social constructs that are governing some of those natural resource management decisions and water management decisions? And how can our projects and programs be of benefit to those who are usually marginalized, not just include them, but genuinely start to shift power dynamics. So that's where you can start to bring in different types of leadership, making proactive decisions to include community leaders and representatives, partner with rights holder organizations or organizations that represent different types of groups to get that expertise into the tent. So that's that transformative end. So that's where we ultimately want to be starting to really orient our projects, and that starts from the design process and even pre-design. Next slide, please. So just a quick point about the connection between water tenure and land. So as we know, in some of the countries, places we are at the moment in Australia, land and water were historically connected, and that is the case in a lot of contexts. And so if water runs past your land or under your land, you have access to it. And so that begs the question, well, who owns the land? And worldwide, women hold less than 15% of land titles, despite the fact they carry out 40% of agricultural work. And that's not even considering the roles and the work that they play in domestic water. So the point there is obviously huge roles and responsibilities with respect to water, but not the ownership to the land and therefore the water. And mostly men obviously hold that land title, and the inheritance laws in a lot of countries really reinforce that process. So yeah, there's a lot to learn from the movements around the world to think about how to make land titling, land tenure, land rights more inclusive, and how can we bring that knowledge into the water tenure space. Next slide, please. I'll talk to this study later if there's more questions about it. Next slide, please. Now, an example of work that we've done with Australian Water Partnership is in the fisheries space. So that's looking more at freshwater fisheries and who has access to the rivers to catch those fish, what type of fish do men and women traditionally catch, what different roles do they play in the whole value chain, and really acknowledging and valuing all of those different roles, not just the catching of the big fish. So we've created a guideline which has some ideas about how to consider gender equality, fisheries, and water scarcity holistically at all the phases of a design, a traditional project design. So you've got your pre-design phase, design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And in that pre-design phase, that's where a lot of that assessment work comes in. The who has access to water, what are the existing governance structures, what's the political economy, who owns the land, all of those sorts of inputs come in at that pre-design phase so that what we do in the water space is well-intentioned but also well-informed. So we'll provide some links to that document after this session, and it also has some basics around the GEDSI key principles, but it is designed for people that are working in that small-scale freshwater fisheries space to consider gender equality and social inclusion, and as I said, really recognize those different roles, but also the importance of those different roles and how our interventions in a river, for instance, to create a weir or a dam for increasing water available to irrigation will have impacts on downstream fisheries. And so that's an environmental impact, but also will impact on men and women differently based on the types of fish that they catch and the roles they have in the fisheries. And then above all of that is the health of those fish and their ability to transmigrate up rivers. So you've got all of those interconnected pieces that are described in that document, which is shown in the next link, the next slide. There's a QR code. Oh, sorry, it's in a minute. I'll go to that in a second. But no, you can move on. But I just moved the slides around in a weird order. So the next example I wanted to provide to you about what does some of this look like in practice is our work in Laos. And that is, again, with the Australian Water Partnership, Alluvium, and the Gender and Diversity Association, Development Association, GDA. And GDA are a wonderful organisation made up of local people who are experts in gender equality and water governance. And so they bring really unique local knowledge and understanding to a water resources project that's informed by the Lao PDR context. So we partnered with them in a river basin planning project for the Namsam. And just by having GDA as part of the project, as our informed, expert advisors, as our on-the-ground supports and also connectors to different parts of the community, the river basin planning process was more inclusive. It was informed by different voices, but also the people that were in the project were trained up by the GDA in training workshops and mentoring and one-on-one supports. So that's an example of when you start to move towards that transformative side of the spectrum by including experts in the countries we work in who can inform us about water resources management issues in that context. You're already starting to shift things if that organisation is paid and is supported, remunerated for their time and expertise. So finally, the link I was mentioning before with the QR code is coming up, but I just wanted to raise a few questions that you can always bring to any situation. Have a look around in that water governance context or project room. Who's in the room? Have efforts been made to seek other perspectives? Who's informing the decisions, the water governance or the water tenure decisions? Who's advantaged by any one decision? or an arrangement to manage the water sharing arrangement or the water tenure arrangement. So asking these very simple questions already gets us moving along that spectrum into a more inclusive direction. So the next slide is finally that QR code I was mentioning, and we will also pop the link in the chat. And I'd also like to acknowledge my dear friends from Myanmar who have supported with inputs into this document. And that's all from me for now. So I'm going to hand over now to Dubravka Bojic, and she's going to take it away from here. Thank you, Dubravka.
Thank you. Thank you, Melita. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Next slide, please. So I think the questions that you made introduce very well the topic of governance. And we know that in the recent decades, let us just remember, massive investments in agriculture and irrigation have clearly allowed to reduce hunger and poverty and to improve lives of millions of people. But this success obviously has come at a high cost. On the one hand, growing overexploitation of water and land and other natural resources, but also of increasing inequalities. And agriculture is obviously central to this challenge, but maximizing different objectives, economic equality, nutrition, environmental sustainability, are competing goals, and they involve important trade-offs and opportunities. How we can work on agriculture to be also the part of the solution. And what is needed really is a paradigm shift. We need to transform our agri-food systems to make them more transformative, sustainable, and more inclusive. But it's not easy. The next slide, please. And it definitely does require more accent and more attention on governance and tenure. Since 1990s, there has been a switch to water demand management, but doing it in practice is very tricky, as everyone who deals with water will recognize, I think. And still today, there persists a significant gap between theory and practice. And we know, we have heard about water tenure, and we have heard about the processes that Melita mentioned. So enhancing water governance and tenure can lead to both the long-term sustainability of water resources management and use, and also to agri-food systems that are more effective, resilient, and equitable. But what do we mean by water governance? Actually, this was a little bit mentioned, and I would say water governance is really all those formal and informal rules and processes in particular, through which different actors, whatever their nature and role and responsibility, do articulate their interests and power relations and make and implement decisions. Actually, governance in a way is what influences to what extent water tenure and rights will actually be enforced. Next slide, please. So understanding water governance and water tenure is really critical if we want to address the key trade-offs between different economic, environmental, and social goals, and improve water management and use. So how can water governance analysis help, and how we can enhance it? Actually, analyzing governance around water management and use can actually allow us to better understand the institutional weaknesses, rights, tenure, practices, and dynamics between different actors, to understand their potentially conflicting interests, concerns, and power relations. And also based on that understanding, to build a coalition of actors who can champion, promote, and support implementation of needed institutional and socio-economic reforms. Next slide, please. So FAO has been working within the framework of the Regional Water Scarcity Initiative and the Water Efficiency, Productivity and Sustainability Project over the last 5 years in the NENA region, where we try to combine water accounting exercise and water governance analysis, so to bring together science, knowledge, and people's inputs for sustainable and equitable water management and use. And obviously working in MENA region is not easy because it is one of the most land and water scarce region in the world, and also the one predicted to be worst affected by climate change. So the tension is really high and the scarcity is increasing more than ever. The governance analysis that we did did not aim to measure the difference according to some kind of indicators or pre-established criteria, but really was aimed to understand what is the reality on the ground and why is it so. Next slide, please. So we worked in 5 countries, in Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Tunisia, and Palestine. In each country, there was a specific study area that was selected, and we applied a very simple 4-phase framework for governance analysis that has been developed within FAO in collaboration with other actors. And the framework is really very flexible, iterative, and done with close engagement of key national stakeholders. So the approach is really problem-focused. We know that water problems are very complex. So this first phase actually allows to identify, to bring the key stakeholders around the key priority issue that we might solve in a relatively shorter term, and that can then trigger the condition for a more bigger change. And once we have identified that key issue, then we go into the institutional analysis. We know that every technical problem is embedded in an institutional and governance setting. So this is where different tools can also be applied and complementary, like the tenure assessment or the GEDIS tool. And we will look into the different formal and informal rules and processes and try to identify what are the key institutional drivers behind our water problem we are focusing on. Then we will look into the political economy, all actors, formal and informal, also national and local territorial ones. What are their relationships? How are decisions taken? Who are influencing the decisions? Those questions that Melita mentioned in her presentation. And then based on these results of the analysis and those findings, we will work together with the key national and local stakeholders to come up with some priorities for action and for change. This process can give us more chances for legitimacy of the actions and interventions that we want to take. Next slide, please. So what we have found in those 5 countries, obviously the 5 countries, you can go to the next slide. We can skip this one on the methodology for the sake of time. Perhaps just to mention that what is important while doing the analysis is really to involve actively, to engage the key stakeholders, including those from the government, because this will then give more legitimacy to the findings and also to the follow-up work on water management and use. So obviously the 5 countries are very different and they face some specific challenges with relation to their water issues, but there are also some common challenges that we have identified in all 5 countries. First, obviously, in all countries, the water users are experiencing diminishing quantity and quality of water resources. But at the same time, there persists, nevertheless, a path dependency on infrastructure and the high expectation that there will be the water supply management from the state Also, while cross-sectoral coordination and policy coherence are very high on the policy agenda and among government priorities, there still persists insufficient cross-sectoral coordination in practice. There are many difficulties in data sharing and use between different agencies and different levels, and also the incoherence between water policy on the one side and relevant sectoral policies, in particular agriculture and energy, with difficult trade-offs that are highly impacting the way the water resources are used and managed. So mainly in most countries, agriculture and economic policies still favor high added value, export-oriented agriculture that is most often highly water consuming. So the typical response to these issues and what in the increasing water scarcity is actually promoting water efficiency, most often through drip irrigation as a measure of demand management. But in practice, and this is something that really happens in many countries, not only in those in MENA where we did the analysis, is that yes, drip irrigation generally does show water efficiency, but at the plot level, while at the same time there is very often in parallel the extension of cultivated areas, thus actually leading to higher water consumption, the so-called Jevons paradox. Also, how are different users reacting? They're adopting the coping strategies that are not conducive to the better water management, illegal pumping, wells and boreholes. We have heard also from Stephen about that. I do have my borehole. And the unpaid fees, resistance to installing water meters, especially for small-scale farmers. Obviously, all this leads to unsustainable governance arrangements and increasing inequalities in access to water for different users. The next slide, please. So, working on this, unfortunately, we did not have sufficient time, and the project ended to work on the follow-up to these findings, but we did observe a number of advances. First, even the only, how to say, doing the governance analysis, engaging the key stakeholders in the analysis itself actually helped to increase the awareness of the key actors on the real state of water scarcity in different countries. So there has been a certain alignment and consensus of the key actors around priority problem and an agreement that something really needs to be done. So another point was real appreciation of the realistic and honest information about the situation. And here, obviously, the water accounting exercise helped, because there has been the water accounting undertaken together with the relevant collection of data around water productivity and a concrete use of water in a given study area. So this actually helped the actors to have the same information and to get this recognition of the need and the potential for change. Who can actually do what are the different roles and responsibilities? And this helped also to bring together certain actors that can then work together to support changes. Initial changes in perception of issues, because obviously, and this links to the issue of data, because in many countries, there are a lot of data actually collected, but different agencies at the national level and then especially at the local level are collecting their own data, but often do not have access to the data that are collected by others, which basically results in the important differences and on the side of different actors. Finally, we have seen a certain engagement and certain improvements in cooperation and coordination between different ministries at the national level and also and especially at the local level, whereby the water basin agencies got engaged a little bit more with the agricultural agencies at the local level. The last slide, please. So finally, I think what is really important is to think once again, as Melita mentioned, about people, to move on. Sometimes we are too much focused on technical issues and sometimes do not give a sufficient attention to people, to those men and women who are using water, who are behind the data that we are collecting. These are some resources and links that may be useful relating to governance, to the water governance analysis, and then the report from the governance analysis done in Tunisia. We have also the e-learning around governance analysis that is available on FAO e-learning academy. And just as the last word, I would like to say that today we are living in ever more difficult world, and we know that having an alliance and working together, working jointly in times of abundance is easy, but when we are facing crisis, this requires much stronger will on the side of the actors to reach a compromise and to come up to the consensus, to work together, even if this can imply renouncing some immediate interest for the general interest of water resources, of nature, people, and our own prosperity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dubravka. Just to highlight the 7th brief of our policy brief series, Next Generation Water Management Policy Briefs, which this webinar is based on. We have recently published Applying Gender Equality, Disability and Social Inclusion Principles in Agricultural Water Resource Management. The purpose of this brief is to provide guidance on turning policy into practice and looks at how you can integrate GEDC safeguards and GEDC considerations into your program. So if you would like to access this brief, please follow the QR code. We will also be releasing another brief series on water tenure later this year, which will look at water tenure case studies from Cambodia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now I'd like to hand over to Lucy to moderate the Q&A. If anyone has questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A box.
Great, thanks, Caroline. And yes, please indicate with your questions as well if there's a particular speaker that you would like the questions to be asked to. And we'll try to get through as many as we can. So to start us off, we've got a question for Dubravka. We've heard about water tenure from Stephen, and you've explained water governance. Would you be able to clarify how governance and tenure differ and how they interact?
Yes, thank you for the question. Indeed, very often this question comes up. You know, water tenure, water governance, are they to what extent they are different? They are different. They are very closely interconnected, but they are different. Water tenure, as Stephen a little bit mentioned, is constructed indeed over a given water source. It may be a well, a spring, or inlet from a river, while water governance actually occurs over a wider level and includes formal and informal rules, and especially processes through which different actors actually decide different water allocation, water distribution, their organization, coordination. In a way, water governance actually determines to what extent water tenure and water rights will be respected and enforced, and how. So basically, water tenure, as I would see it, I don't know if Stephen will agree and he can react to that, is in effect a subset of the processes occurring within water governance, spelling out the rules governing water management and use. So I would say water governance is really around water allocation, distribution, organization, and coordination. It looks at the people, at the power and voice. And many issues and challenges in water governance are linked actually to the issues in water tenure. So that's why if we really want to advance, to address water scarcity, to balance between different economic, social, and environmental objectives, we do need to understand both water tenure and water governance.
Thank you, Dubravka. Stephen, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I don't really have a problem with what Dubravka said at all. I mean, I think that water governance is broader. I think that it's very much perhaps a question of perspective and what you're focusing on. In terms of water users, in a sense, people who depend directly on water resources, tenure is the key issue. That's all they care about. Where I get my water, how secure is my water, governance, all that stuff is further away. But of course, it's entirely linked. So I think I have no problem with what Dubravka said. It is complex as well. I would say, yeah, governance is broader. In terms of our water tenure assessments, I had to talk a bit quickly, so I hope it wasn't too unclear. But when we try and look at the governance of tenure, we're trying to look at the way government's decisions impact on tenure specifically. So we're trying to focus very narrowly on how the big system impacts tenure arrangements, the different types of tenure arrangements. So we're respecting the fact that governance is a bigger system, and we're focusing on its specific impacts on how decisions are made regarding the use of water and our relationships with water. So yeah, it's complex, and I think we'll carry on discussing this. We have some diagrams with nested boxes with governance and tenure, but you know, it's like many of these things. It's like, you know, life is complex too. So yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. We've had another question come through. I think this might be for you, Dubravka. The question is, how did the project look at outcomes of different water allocations? Was it based on water per se or linked to any agricultural outcome, in brackets, productivity?
Well, actually, it was basically linked to water per se, but what was obviously we were looking into to what extent what is actually allocated corresponds to what actually users receive. This was a especially tricky question in Tunisia, where we were looking into the Low Niger basin, where basically from, and this is a little bit what Stephen mentioned, from the dam going downstream, obviously the last region downstream received some 70% of its allocated water quantity, obviously because of the illegal pumping happening along the line. But on the other hand, through the water accounting and water productivity exercise, we were also looking at to what extent the actual water use corresponds to the water productivity. And what was found is that actually there was the water needed for irrigation was much lower than what was actually used for irrigation by different actors. But obviously the key issues that comes upon in these cases is really to what extent what is allocated actually arrives to the users because of all those issues along the line.
Thanks, Dubravka. Melita, a question for you. You talked about how it's important to consider JEDSI at all stages of the project cycle, so from planning through to implementation. Could you talk in a bit more detail about where there might be some key entry points? Thanks.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. So as I mentioned in that pre-design phase, really having a good look at the stakeholder mapping process is going to be essential, and as I mentioned, casting that net wide When we talk about farmers, are we just looking at those who, as I said, own the land and irrigate and larger scale farming? Or are we looking at small scale farming and kitchen gardens and the groundwater resources that they might be dependent upon, etc.? So that stakeholder mapping process is obvious one, but a lot of projects don't go that extra mile and really look at all the different water users and their needs. And then in the design process, it is really great to have those organizations and individuals as much as possible around the table to help design what that water sharing. Ultimately, it's about water sharing. We've got this quantity of water expected to be in the environment with the climate change modeling, with our understanding of the hydrology, whatever the inputs are and the supply demand picture that's built up there. But how do we share that? How do we share that equitably? Are there going to be trade-offs? Are some people going to have to reduce what they currently use? What's the economic impact on them or the livelihoods, etc.? So that the trade-offs process is fraught. And in Australia, as a lot of people know, without doing proper consultation and having a decent understanding of all the stakeholders, including water for the environment and animals and traditional owners and all of the different industries down the river, etc., and the upstream downstream politics, of course, as has just been mentioned. So without a really deep dive into all of that, there will be problems down the line, and people won't respect the water sharing arrangements, and there will be deviations from it. So the legal, as Dubravka just said, the legal instruments are only as good as how they're implemented, and that stakeholder engagement really sets a system up for better implementation and adherence at the end of the day. So they're just a few top of mind ideas.
Thanks, Melita, for those examples and for highlighting how and why it's important to have a proper understanding of existing arrangements. There's another question to both Steve and Dubravka. How to ensure that the political governance system, so administrative and development agencies, and the water governance systems are integrated, often when the latter is designed on hydrological boundaries.
Steve, you want to start?
Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
No. Well, I mean, this is one of the big problems we have. I mean, in every other aspect of life, we don't follow hydrological boundaries. We follow state level or administrative boundaries or provincial boundaries. And in water, we come along and say, we want to be different. And it's a really huge problem. And in the water sector, we just take it so much for granted. But I mean, you know, it's totally counterintuitive for everybody else. And it's also made worse with the, if you like, the trend for decentralization, which is probably a good idea if you can afford it. It makes things even more complicated because, of course, the water doesn't respect administrative boundaries. So yeah, how do you deal with that? I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I make a big fuss about making sure that our water legislation is very clear that we are an exception. We're claiming special treatment for water because of the nature of the resource. And I think though you have to make the argument within government, but you also have to make sure that the legislation is clear on hydraulic boundaries and their role, but also that you can somehow make sure you don't disregard local government at whatever level, subnational government at whatever level. So you have to make sure that you design a role for them in your hydraulic boundary arrangements, which is not easy. And yeah, it's a real challenge. But I mean, from a legal and institutional perspective, I think that's the best you can do. Otherwise, you're going to end up with very strange decisions. I hope I've got the question right. Maybe I've gone off on a complete tangent. But I'll give the floor to Dubravka.
Thanks, Steve. Indeed, this is the key question, I would say, and what makes things very complicated in practice, obviously. And we have seen that in all 5 countries almost, that depending, in some countries this is a little bit less relevant, in some a bit more, that actually on the ground there is no this let's say the collaboration and cooperation of administratively competent agencies along the hydrological boundaries, let's say, no? So if we have basin, then this is one of the issues that came up during the analysis itself, indeed, and how what might be some of the governance arrangements that could be put in place to ensure that collaboration between the relevant administrative agencies that are there, because obviously the Water Basin Agency has this competence to cover the basin, but at the same time they have to work also with the administrative agencies that are relevant and in charge for specific along the boundaries, so to say. So this is really indeed one of the key issues that has to be understood and looked at during the institutional and governance analysis, because it is also relevant for tenure and for water management aspects.
Okay. Can I just jump in? One other point is about we should be careful about river basin agencies. Very often, particularly the World Bank but other donors love setting up river basin agencies as new bodies. I think we should be really careful about that. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have structures at the basin level, but we should be really careful about doing this kind of cut and paste river basin council, river basin agency approach, because that's expensive, costly, often doesn't work, and we need to be very, very careful about that. I'll stop.
Thanks, Stephen. We have another question from Melita. This question is asking, are there any leading examples of people with disability and Indigenous peoples engaged in water governance decision-making that affected their lives and they really benefited from those decisions?
Great question, thank you. And I feel that my colleagues from Oxfam Cambodia, from the Mekong Water Governance Program, will have a lot to say on this question as well to answer it. But one example that comes straight to mind is working in Timor-Leste with WaterAid, and they've had a partnership with RHTO for more than 10 years, and they've brought that organization, which is an organization for people with disabilities, into their programming at a number of levels: the design, the engagement, monitoring, evaluation. But they've also worked to strengthen that organization as a whole. And so even though the issue is water and sanitation, the strength and the confidence and the influence of that rights holder organization has grown through the partnership. So I think that's a really good example. I'll just post a link to that in the chat now. And yes, in Australia, we have lots of examples of very strong Indigenous engagement, traditional owners influencing processes more and more. But as one of our AWP colleagues, Bradley Mogridge, says in some of his interviews and discussion on this topic, that Indigenous people were cut out of that process of the land and water entitlements very, with the invasion of Australia. And so to change that and to take those systems away and rebalance things or reassess things, it takes a lot of time and a lot of activism and work from Indigenous peoples. But yeah, there are lots of examples around Australia. Very happy to send you specific links if you'd like after this. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Melita. So we've probably got time for one more question. I'll ask this one to Stephen. So there have been some recent water tenure assessments conducted in Indonesia and Vietnam. Would you be able to explain why water tenure is particularly relevant to countries in this region?
Sure. So, well, there are a number of reasons. So it's difficult to actually prioritize. Of course, question of allocation and demand is huge. It's not going away. It's a very fast-growing region, and we face this dilemma about water for energy, water for food, water for people. So it's becoming acute. We're also in the Southeast Asia for 3 of the countries, in particular Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They're going through significant periods of transition in terms, particularly economic transition and changing economic paradigms and approaches. And that is a very, very complicated process in terms of water, because one of the key issues is that historically a lot of decisions on water allocation have been made by irrigation departments and by public agencies, because of the sort of centralized or command-based approach to economic development. And now we're kind of really rubbing up against some of the barriers, if you like, because of the lack of water. And so if we have separate development of hydropower, separate development of agriculture, separate development of water supply, without actually working out where the water comes from, but also who has priority, it's a big issue. So in certain of the Southeast Asian countries, the water supply utilities don't have any rights to water. Everyone assumes, as that was kind of like what I was alluding to in the diagram, that very often with water supply, yes, it's a government water supply, therefore it's protected, but nothing stops somebody else building a factory immediately upstream or diverting the water completely upstream. And now it's getting to a stage where we really need to take a more holistic approach and look at all of these claims on water and all of these relationships between people and water resources as individuals, as private investors, if you like, but also public bodies. How do you link hydropower releases with irrigation? It's a 10-year question. It's a crucial one for the region. So I don't want to take up too much time. We could probably talk about this for hours, but hopefully I've given a small answer to the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. We will have to wrap up the questions now. Thanks to everyone who sent one through. I'll now hand back to Caroline for closing remarks.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's been great to host such a knowledgeable panel of speakers who shared their extensive experience and expertise and perspectives on enhancing water governance and management in the Asia-Pacific region, and from Dubravka from the Near East and North Africa. As we close, I'd just like to recap some of the highlights. So today we've highlighted the varied and complex water tenure arrangements that exist in the region. Understanding and navigating these complexities is vital for the development of policies that support both sustainable practices and equitable water distribution. Our discussion underscored how gender equality, disability, and social inclusion are pivotal in water resource management. These elements are not just ethical imperatives, but are also essential to creating sustainable water management systems that benefit everyone. We've learned about the critical importance of incorporating diverse stakeholders' voices, particularly marginalized communities, to ensure that water governance is equitable and effective. We delved into the innovative governance frameworks that are transforming water management in the NENA region and beyond, showing that adaptive and forward-thinking policies can significantly impact water sustainability. As we conclude, I hope this webinar has provided you with new insights and ideas that you can take back to your communities and organizations. The challenges are significant, but with continued collaboration and commitment, we can achieve sustainable water management that supports both the people and the planet. Thank you once again for participating and being so engaging. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Have a wonderful day.
Bye. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.